Driving down the causeway into Stone Harbor, our thoughts are on the sand and the sea ahead. But the earthy smell of the salt marsh fills the car and draws our eyes to the miles of grass on either side as we race by. So empty, so still. But it is not empty. It is alive beyond our imagination. The gulls and the geese and the waterfowl have called this land home forever and shared it with the fish and crabs and clams and crawling creatures who make up the food chain. It is a land that is half land and half water, an area that is unchanged not for 100 years, but for a millennium. The tidal marsh hangs like an emerald necklace around the neck of South Jersey, offering tremendous diversity, an ecosystem that is home to millions of life forms, a source of recreation, and a buffer that saves us from Atlantic storms. Let us take a short tour of this remarkable 12 square miles that lies directly behind Stone Harbor. We will go back into the past to 1700, when the first English settlers came to Cape May County, and we will look at the places, waterways, and islands that make up the salt marsh. And finally, we will look at the birds, fish, and animals who live here today, and the valuable ecosystem that protects our homes and helps to feed us. Cape May County was first settled by Europeans when a group of 70 families bought land here between 1690 and 1700. They were English yeomen from Long Island, whalers and farmers who had been coming down here to whale on a part-time basis, and bought land when the West Jersey Society offered it for sale. Most of their plantations were 300 to 700 acres and included firm land and also the sea meadow that is at the heart of our story. Historian Jamie Hand is a direct descendant of those first families. He grew up in Cape May County and knows the back bays and marsh as a decoy maker and a waterfowl guide. Self-taught, he has become the go-to historian for South Jersey.
People came down here. The main impetus for them coming here was whales. They're farmers first, a lot of them are whalers second. It was a lucrative but dangerous pastime. Whale oil was a very expensive commodity. They didn't move down here permanently until 1690 when the land became available for purchase. If you're an English yeoman, title of land is everything. You don't go anywhere where you don't own the land. I can't stress enough how important that is. By 1700, the records show that we have 70 families in Cape May County, 70 heads of household. 11 of those were hands, by the way, hand families. But you also have the Corsons, the Townsends, the Leamings, the Ludlams, the Stites, and on and on and on. Our early settlers here in the county, they farmed, they whaled, but another big part of their livelihood that falls between the cracks sometimes is how important the back bays and the sounds were to them. Harvesting of clams and oysters was a very important part of their life, not just for their own sustenance, but also for export. In 1750s, Jacob Spicer recorded that multiple vessels would go to Philadelphia every season with oysters and clams from Cape May County. The salt marsh, every acre of salt marsh was recorded and surveyed and deeded just like the highland, the forest and the farmland. That's how important it was. The salt meadow was mowed by hand for the salt hay and used as primarily as fodder or feed for cattle and horses. They would dike the small streams over a tract of salt marsh to keep the water out, to make the water level, make it drier so it was easier to mow. By the 1800s, they'd be using horses pulling mowing machines. Here are some meadow shoes made by a local blacksmith here in Goshen, New Jersey. These were used in the salt hay industry, they were strapped onto the bottom of the horses' hooves to keep them from sinking into the soft mud when they harvested the salt hay. Stone Harbor, from Nummy's Island to Genesis Bay and Jenkins Sound, every acre was mowed for salt hay once a year, and let alone the gunning that took place for waterfowl. My ancestors, a good part of their diet was clams and oysters and waterfowl, along with you can name on one hand the crops they grew, rye, wheat, and Indian corn. Today, the locals and tourists alike see the salt marsh, and we think of it as a wilderness, and in effect it is. But for the past 300 years, it was a different story. It was bustling with activity. You had multiple trades going on, clammers, oystermen, men mowing salt hay, tidal mills at work. It was bustling with activity.
Our salt marsh contains many channels, creeks, bays, and islands. In the early days of South Jersey, these waterways were the highways that enabled the original settlers to ship clams, fish, and cedar posts to the world. The channels appear random today, but listen to what our first settlers called them. Hereford Inlet, Drum Thoroughfare, the Great Channel, Bluefish Creek, Turtle Gut, Go Through Creek, Dung Thoroughfare, Scotch Bonnet, and the vast Jenkins Sound and Shell Bay. And don't forget the islands, West Island, White Island, Buck Island, and the most famous, Nummy Island. The undeveloped Nummy Island is the piece of salt marsh that carries the road from Stone Harbor to Wildwood, and it is noticeable for the large mound of dredging on the north side. The island got its name from the legendary King Nummy, who with other local Lenape chiefs sold most of what is now Cape May County to Dr. Daniel Cox of London, England in the mid-1600s. Back when King Nummy walked the island, it was wooded with much more stable ground than it has today. The trees were probably washed out to sea in a long-ago hurricane, and up until the early 1900s, the island was mowed for its salt grass.
Back in the 50s, my wife and I used to go crabbing on Nummy Island. We would take our small metal boat as far as we could up Matgut Creek and walk across the wetlands to the tidal ponds. We wore sneakers and clothing that covered us to keep off the flies. The footing was mostly solid, but you had to be careful crossing the small streams and stay out of the muck. We often caught a half bushel of the 6-inch blue-clawed crabs. During one trip, I saw a weakfish 2 feet long in a small pond, and I often wondered how in the world he ever got there.
The Great Channel, which lies directly behind Stone Harbor, is the deepest and busiest channel back there. Aside from the great boating and fishing it provides, it is part of the Intercoastal Waterway, which enables cargo to pass from Maine all the way to Texas without going out to sea. The waterway was first proposed in 1808 as part of our national defense system.
Back in the 30s, when I was in my teens, I used to explore the Marsh Islands in my shorts and sneakers. I hunted fiddler crabs for bait. When it was hot, I used to jump into the creeks to cool off. There was one hole out there so deep, I would run and jump high into the air and torpedo down into the cool water. I never did reach the bottom of that hole. Katie Sellers of the Wetlands Institute tells me there are holes 30 feet deep in a number of the tidal creeks.
Jenkins Channel is the large channel that goes from Hereford Inlet past Nummy Island. Back in the day, this channel was dredged to allow 40-foot commercial fishing boats to come into Jenkins Sound where they could unload their catch at Shell Bay or Benny's Landing. Today, the bay is only deep enough for kayaks and very shallow draft boats. But at the turn of the century, Benny's Landing was a very busy fishing village, with 10 or 12 homes on a winding road that went underwater with very high tides.
One day back in the 70s when I was fishing with my 3 sons in my son John's 12-foot metal boat on Dung Thoroughfare. It was windy and we were drifting for flounder, all intently watching our rods and lines when all of a sudden, just behind us, there was a tremendous crash against the side of the boat. Water sprayed high into the air and a huge 6-foot shark shot past the boat into deeper water. I guess we trapped him between the boat and the bank, and he didn't like that.
Coming into town just south of the boulevard is the old Stone Harbor Canal. Most people don't even know it is there. It was dredged back in the early 1900s for boats to transport people and cargo to the rapidly growing town. Originally 100 feet wide and 9 feet deep, it ran for a mile and a half down to Scotch Bonnet. Scotch Bonnet grew up on the causeway as a fishing center and as a place where visiting tourists from Philadelphia and New York could stop to fish and set crab traps. It is the main channel going past the back end of the Wetlands Institute today. Knowing the names of islands and channels may help you navigate through the bay, but the real story is the life hidden among the marshlands. The grasses on the islands reach over 2 feet in height, and while it looks low from a distance, it hides thousands of birds and other forms of wildlife. For the third part of our movie, we turn to the experts at the Wetlands Institute, who have been protecting our marsh and educating the public for over 40 years. Katie Sellers is our own homegrown scientist. She grew up on Shell Bay and learned to love the local salt marsh ecosystem while fishing and enjoying the outdoor with her family. After earning a master's degree in marine affairs and policy from the University of Miami, Katie has returned to the area to work as a conservation scientist for the Wetlands Institute.
Our salt marsh is a gigantic green nursery that transforms sunlight into energy for plants and then for all living things. Far from empty, the salt marsh is teeming with life, and the air is filled with the cries of young birds. Fish spawn in the back bay, as do crabs, clams, and the millions of insects and organisms they feed on. Sometimes, looking out over the grass, you can almost see the marsh pulsing with new life. One of the more unique of our species is the diamondback terrapin, the salt marsh's only resident reptile. In May, June, and July, female terrapins crawl out of the water in search of higher ground and sandy soils to dig a nest. Some of the only traffic jams on Stone Harbor Boulevard occur when drivers stop to help a terrapin cross the road safely as she searches for the perfect spot to lay her eggs. 60 days later, young terrapins, about the size of quarters, emerge from their nests and crawl into the marsh where they will find the food and shelter necessary for surviving the first of their 30 years of life. Our diamondback terrapin is the only turtle species that is capable of living in the brackish waters of our back bay. Osprey, or fishhawks, as many local call them, migrate to the salt marsh for the summertime. With incredible eyesight, osprey can easily spot a fish swimming within our murky plankton-filled waters from high in the sky. Osprey are among the best fishers of the salt marsh, but they come here not just for the fishing. Each bird travels from wintering areas in South and Central America, flying thousands of miles to meet here and raise their young. Osprey may mate for life, but migrate separately and return each year, often to the same nest site in our back bay. Endangered by DDT and declining by the 1970s, the osprey rebounded spectacularly with the ban on DDT and the construction of artificial habitat. 35 years ago, there were 68 pairs of osprey in all of New Jersey. Now today, there are 58 pairs in the Stone Harbor vicinity alone. Many locals who rarely saw osprey in their childhood are now astounded by the number of osprey they can see today. Cape May County salt marshes also act as a prime stop for many migrating birds during spring and fall. Every spring, thousands of shorebirds find food and a place to rest in South Jersey's salt marshes, including some of our longest distance migrants. While in the midst of their migration, shorebirds utilize our local marsh and beach habitat as a feeding and resting site in order to gain the energy needed to continue on to the Arctic. The Atlantic brant travels up to 7,000 miles from its Arctic breeding ground to reach our coastline. Nearly 70% of all brants winter along the New Jersey coast, where they bring much song and fanfare to the salt marsh. For humans, the salt marsh is incredibly important. A high percentage of the local seafood catch that we consume begins life in the salt marsh. This is a strong reason to keep buildings and runoff out and to keep our marshes healthy. The marsh also acts as a buffer, absorbing the ocean's powerful energy, protecting the mainland. With 2 high tides that enter the salt marsh daily, the ecosystem additionally acts as a large sponge and absorbs the excessive water funneling into the back bays from the ocean. If it weren't for our salt marsh, we would have flooding daily on our mainland and much worse damage from large storms and hurricanes. Throughout Hurricane Sandy's storm surge, our wetlands absorbed the storm's waters, and the Wetlands Institute building suffered minimal flooding damage. What's more, the salt marsh also acts as a natural water filtration system. As oil from our cars or fertilizers from our yards are washed by rainwaters into the salt marsh, the marsh mud, grasses, and microorganisms filter impurities from our water before it enters into our back bays and oceans. Thanks to the salt marsh, we can all enjoy the back bays of Stone Harbor.
So, that is it. That is our tour of the Back Bay behind Stone Harbor. We hope you have gained knowledge of our past history, the geography, the importance of the wetlands to us all. Maybe it is time to get off of Stone Harbor Boulevard. Visit the Wetlands Institute. Go crabbing. Grab your binoculars for bird watching. Explore the Back Bay for yourself and appreciate this remarkable 12 square miles of waterways and salt meadow.